Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Richard Brent, and I'm the co-founder of the Anxiety Breakthrough Program, along with Sarah. Good to have you on board. Um, this evening, I say this evening, I'm based in the UK, so maybe it's a different time of the day wherever you are, but great to have you here. So today's presentation is called "That's It, It's Ruined," and it's really all about what we would term catastrophizing, which is the dramatization of thoughts and imagination that then creates stress and anxiety. So, for those of you who joined my recent or watched the recent video that I put up on how we create symptoms, I had a picture of a pressure gauge, and this is how we build up stress and anxiety. Uh, Catastrophizing is a way to really move this needle around, and it can really have a very negative impact on us in terms of just not just our overall stress levels, but um, other symptoms that might be triggered by our catastrophic thinking. And the list of that is quite extensive as well. That could be any kind of compulsive symptom. So that might mean boozing, smoking, recreational drugs. It can be other types of symptoms, particularly prevalent with things like IBS. People tend to be, people suffer from IBS. They'll often have a lot of their stress will be driven by the catastrophic processing of things going on in their life. So, what is catastrophizing? Well, as I've said, it is really where we dramatize things. I'm struggling to say that word this evening. We over dramatize things in our minds. It can be verbal. So I might say there's a world of difference, right? If I say, "Where's my car keys?" to "Where's my bloody car keys?" Already I've started to exaggerate it and build it up. But I think really when we get into catastrophizing and creating a lot of stress, a lot of it is what I call visual in our head. So what I mean by that is it's situations that we imagine happening, the worst case scenario situations that we imagine happening, and we only tend to replace that thought in our head when we manage to think of something even worse. So a very basic example of that, maybe if your partner's a bit late home, you might think, "Oh, they've been in an accident." And then you just start picturing in your head, the police knocking on the door to give you the dreadful news and all this kind of stuff. So this would be a very, very basic example of catastrophizing. Um, when we do catastrophize, and I'll use some more examples in a moment to make a bit more sense of this. Now, as it happens, I know an awful lot about catastrophizing because I used to be such a catastrophic thinker myself. I've got a wonderful imagination. I suppose the phrase "making a mountain out of a molehill" that certainly would have applied to me previously before I got into this line of work. Um, but when we start catastrophizing and that process, it always starts off with something relatively low level. So what I've got here is a graph of stress and anxiety on the y-axis, and then time here. But initially, it's quite the thoughts are quite low level. So let's use an example. So if I think back to when I started out as a therapist, it was just getting on for 20 years ago now, so it's been a little while. The first couple of years, my kids were quite young. They're now both grown up, but they were quite young at the time. And I remember distinctly this particular week where my son had a cold, been a bit unwell, and when he was young, he used to get these temperature spikes, and sometimes it would happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, so it'd wake you up, and it's all a little bit stressful as it is being a parent sometimes. Um, but I did really well that week to manage my thinking and keep a lid on my catastrophic thoughts until I got through to Saturday morning. And at that time, I used to work out of a therapy centre in Dartford, in Kent, in the UK. And the therapy centre was open from 9 till 4. And I used to book on a Saturday, it'd be my busiest day. I would book a client on the hour every hour. Um, if a client cancelled, I would use that as my lunch break. Sometimes I didn't get a lunch break, but to be honest, that was never an issue. But I do remember very distinctly this particular morning. I got in the shower, and I was getting ready to to go and do my day's work, and I just had this little thought into my head. All it was my wife's going to want to come up and have a shower before I go because with the two young kids, once I've gone out the door, she won't get a chance to. That means I won't have time for breakfast. And I just took that, if you think about it, I won't have time for breakfast. This is very much down here on this end of the scale. But I just took that and exaggerated it, catastrophized it. Because my next thought was, oh no, what's that going to be like at 1:30, 2 o'clock? I'm going to be starving hungry. So straight away, my language becomes more dramatic. It's just between me and you, I don't think I've ever been starving in my life. Um, but I start to create this drama. And in my head, then my imagination kicks in, and I started to imagine one of my client sessions falling apart because I couldn't concentrate on the session because I was so hungry. Okay, so you get the idea of this process, but as I mentioned, I have got a very good imagination, so I did not stick with that thought for very long. My next thought was, "Oh no, what's it going to be like? 4 o'clock when I'm finishing the day." And in my head, I just started to visualize myself being stretched out of the therapy center into the back of an ambulance, because I'd fainted through malnutrition. Now just between me and you, I'm sure you're thinking you look like you could do more than 7 hours without eating before you had to worry about anything, Richard, and that would be true. Um, but when I create this stuff in my head, if you think about what is my reality, I don't mean this in a philosophical sense, but my reality is really how I interpret things in my mind. Um, it's not even so much about what's going on around me. And this is we know this because let's say in my little office here, if I brought 10 people in and asked them to describe it to me, I get 10 completely different answers. Some people say it's really bright. Some people say I love the double aspect. Some people say it's a bit small. Some people say it feels a bit cramped because I've got the sloping roof here. The room remains constant, but the interpretation is different. It's how people perceive it in their mind. So as I'm having these catastrophic thoughts, my stress levels are starting to build up, and I'm moving along this what I would call an exponential curve as I start to build up anxiety very, very quickly. Hopefully that struck a chord with some of you who are catastrophic. You may have had similar thoughts yourself. You know, I, 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 I do recall another thought from that day, and it just goes to show how far you can go with this stuff. And my other thought was, that's it. It's ruined. I'm not cut out for this line of work. I should find a different business to be involved with, a different career. So in the space of about 2 minutes, I've gone from not having time for breakfast to writing off my entire career. Um, so you get the idea how quickly we lose perspective, and that's really what catastrophizing is all about. It's a sudden, very quick loss of perspective, and basically, the further I come along this scale on this graph, the harder it is to get my sense of perspective back. So if I'm up here, it's going to be much harder than if I'm down this end of the scale down here. So just think about that for a second. So we will come back to what we can do up here, but one of the things we do want to do as a starting point with our catastrophic thinking is just recognize the thoughts. Start to pay some attention to the thoughts in our head, and looking out for these ones where there might be, the language might become a bit more dramatic, or I might start to visualize something in a very dramatic way, and my perspective is starting to shift. I'm starting to lose my perspective on things. Now, I should point out at this point in time, sometimes I get questions on this. Well, is that not good risk management, Richard? There is a world of difference between risk management and catastrophizing. When we do some risk management, we very sensibly take into account the likelihood or probability of something happening. When we catastrophize, we're not doing that at all. We are um, just going with an assumption that this is my reality and this is going to happen. There's no assessment of how likely that is to happen. And actually, do I need to pay any attention of it? So, the first thing I want to do is recognize, these catastrophic thoughts. If I do recognize one, the very next thing I'm going to do is give myself a great big pat on the back. You don't have to do this physically, but mentally, well done me for recognizing it. This is really important because it breaks a cycle. I can't stress that enough. Sometimes what happens when people, if they're a bit catastrophic, um, and they might be a little bit self-critical as well, alongside it, they might recognize they've had a catastrophic thought, and then they might say something to themselves like, "Oh, there I go again, bloody idiot." And so we've already compounded it. And so we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we interrupt it. And that's why this pat on the back, well done me for recognizing it, it's really important to interrupt that cycle. Then what we're going to do is challenge that thought and actually really ask ourselves a question. How likely is this, uh, what's the probability of this actually happening? And really challenging our sense of perspective more than anything. That particular example, I would say I was up here on the scale somewhere. I had really started to move along here, um, and I did just that. I was a tiny bit self-critical. I did think, "What are you doing, Richard?" Which is slightly judgmental. A big pat on the back would have been better, but then I just thought about it, and I just thought, "Well, is this really likely to happen? Am I going to pass out?" And I reminded myself that actually, I'd done this before quite a few times actually, where I got to work without having breakfast and not finished, till I saw my last client, at 4 o'clock. And all I can remember about it is I didn't even notice I was hungry because when you're engaged in doing something, you tend not to notice. I remember walking back to the car after that particular day's work and thinking to myself, I'm a bit peckish. I'll get something in the garage on the way home, just pick up a snack. And that was it. There was no ambulance. There was no need to write off my business. And the moment I had those thoughts, I moved quickly back down here to having really low stress levels and a good sense of perspective. And when I think about that day in particular, the moment I got my perspective back, I was able to get on with things. If you think about catastrophizing, it does lead to all sorts of things like procrastination as well, and putting things off and maybe not taking up opportunities. But that particular day, I did actually find time for breakfast before I left because I wasn't running around like a headless chicken. I um, I left for work about 5 minutes later than I normally would, but seemed to get there on time because I wasn't driving like an idiot. Every single session of therapy I seemed to do that day seemed to go really well. But I did think back on, at the end of the day, I think, well, what would have happened had I carried on catastrophizing that morning? Well, I would probably have upset Sarah for sure. Probably been grumpy, stroppy. I probably would have, I hate to think what my driving would have been like, and it doesn't even come into question. I hate to think what the session of therapy would have been like as well. Um, so this kind of thing can have a really big impact on us. It does build up a lot of stress and anxiety, which can fuel our other symptoms as well. Um, the important thing to remember about it, though, is it is a learned way of thinking. There's nothing genetic about catastrophizing. Okay, it is a learned way of thinking. So typically, if I'm a bit catastrophic, one of my parents or my primary caregivers may well have been a bit catastrophic, and that's where we kind of learn this way of thinking when we're younger. So that doesn't mean that we can't change it, because of course we can. And the more I recognize my catastrophic thinking, the more I challenge it, I make sure I give myself that pat on the back, the less likely I am to follow that up with another catastrophic thought, because it is just a learned way of thinking. I think the Americans call it spiraling. That's a very common word these days. But I'll stick with good old catastrophizing, because I think when I say that word, we all know what that means. And if you're not particularly catastrophic yourself, have a look around you. You will notice that some people are. Some people very much are. And certainly, if you're a therapist or coach, you'll notice that some of your clients are, most definitely. So, now, I did say I was going to talk a bit about what we can do up here, and we will do that. We'll come back to that though, because I've got another very important question for you in relation to this. It might sound a bit of an odd question, but particularly for those of you who are a bit catastrophic, have a think about where you'd most likely be when you catastrophize. So what I mean by that is, I don't mean sometimes when I ask a client that question, they might say, "Well, I'd be in an emotionally terrible place, Richard." I don't mean where you'd be emotionally. I mean actually where you'd be physically. Um, and there's really some differences in terms of, particularly when we catastrophize to an extreme degree. um I'm not saying we couldn't catastrophize down at the supermarket, getting our shopping, paying for our goods at the checkout, particularly if you look at some of the prices these days with a bit of inflation. Certainly, can fuel a bit of catastrophic thinking. But you in that kind of environment, I'm willing to wager that you'd keep a lid on it. Okay, so you wouldn't get much beyond this kind of area here on our graph. Um, but there are times when we do go beyond that if we're a bit of a catastrophic thinker. And if you think about where those places are, I would say the number one most likely place you'd be is actually at home in bed. Uh, Second most likely place you'd be is around your house. The example I just used, I was in the shower when I was having those catastrophic thoughts. Uh, Other examples be if you drive and you're driving somewhere on your own, that can be a good opportunity to catastrophize. Work can be a bit mixed. Often it depends on what I'm going to come to next, actually. But first of all, just think about that for a second. Then, why am I more likely to catastrophize being at home and particularly being in bed than I am down the supermarket? Now, some people would say the obvious answer there is distraction. That does have an element to play here, but it's not the main element. The main element is all about safety. We never really dive into this stuff to an extreme degree when I'm in a really safe environment. Now, being at home in bed might not be my safest environment, but it's often perceived that it is. Okay. Um, I always remember a client when I was talking to them about this years ago, and she said to me, "Oh, I know what you mean, Richard, because this particular young lady, she was late 20s and she lived on her own. And she said, the other night, I thought someone had smashed my back door. The glass of my back door was coming in. I thought they were coming in to burgle the house." I said, "Oh, sounds dreadful. What did you do? Did you call the police?" And she said, "No, I hid under the duvet." Like the duvet's got some magic protective power or something. Now, as it happened, someone hadn't broken in. She'd heard the noise next door with some breaking some glass. But it is often the perceived. I'm not sure it is the safest place at home, but it's often the perceived safest place. It's just being under the duvet. Um, Generally, we should feel safe at home. Hopefully, we do. Not everyone does. I understand that. Some people in some very difficult home arrangements and home life, but most people do feel comfortable at home. So again, this is a great environment to catastrophize. Often, I use the example with driving, particularly if you're driving on your own. You know, when I learned to drive over 30 years ago, um, you couldn't really have a conversation if I got my car up to 60 miles an hour because of the noise and the vibration. You never really felt that safe. I can't be honest. Now cars are completely different. You got side impact protection bags, airbags, um, all kinds of driving aids to help keep you safe. Um, and I sometimes don't even realize. I went on a speed awareness course because I had a speeding ticket a number of years ago, and I was expecting to be one of the oldest people on there, and I was actually one of the youngest. And the reason for it is, when I learned to drive, and a lot of the other people in that room would have learned to drive, you didn't have to worry too much about your speedometer because you've got a sense of speed from, the noise of the vehicle, the vibration. Now you don't get any of that with a car. It's really hard to tell whether you're doing 30 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour. It's very difficult. You don't get that feedback. So what that means is generally, often we perceive being in the car as a really safe space. Now, of course, it might not be. I'm not saying it is, but the perception is that we are. So, what does this really tell us then? What am I getting at? Why am I bringing up this particular issue? Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is I think when we catastrophize, and particularly if we've got a really good imagination, this feels like something that is happening to us, not necessarily something that we're doing. But of course, it is something that we're doing, and what I'm really getting at is we're already making a conscious choice over when and where we catastrophize. We're already exerting influence over when some people would say allow ourselves to do it. I think that's a bit soft. I would say choose to do it. Okay, it's a choice. So, if it wasn't a choice, we'd lose our, shit down at the supermarket, but we tend not to do that. We tend to keep a lid on it. Okay, we tend to save that for, other areas where we feel really, really in a safe environment. Hope all that makes sense. So I did want to, label that last point because obviously, this is something that if you start to challenge, because it is, I, I said earlier, it's learned behavior. It is a learned way of thinking. You could almost say that it becomes a habit. And if we don't really look at it and understand the impact it's having, the negative impact of all this stress and anxiety that it creates, and the impact potentially on other symptoms as well, then we're less motivated to do something about it. But obviously, we can do something about it. I would say most people can get on top of their catastrophic thinking with a bit of consistent effort in about 2 to 4 weeks. This pat on the back is really important. right? If you want to make any changes, it's important to be encouraging to yourself, not hard on yourself, right? Beating yourself up and giving yourself a hard time does not build up good self confidence and belief that you can make a change. It actually has the opposite impact. It holds us back. So this here is really important. You don't have to do it physically. You might get some strange looks if you do, but mentally, well done me for recognizing it. And the earlier I recognize it, the lower my stress levels, the much easier it is to challenge and get my perspective back. So with all of that said, I did say we would chat about what we can do when we're up here. So sometimes, I mean, the key to this is really um, recognizing down this stage here. But sometimes we don't recognize it until we're really in it and we can see we're in a bit of an emotional state. I guess a good analogy for this, when I think about catastrophizing, I always view it as, rolling a snowball down a hill, right? So you start at the top of the hill and you start rolling a bit of snow around. I don't know. You get a good, two handfuls of snow together that's in a little ball. Now, if you start rolling that down the hill, as it goes down the hill, it tends to, you know, pick up more snow and get bigger, and the speed tends to pick up. So, momentum equals mass times velocity. Um, so, halfway down the hill, if we wanted to stop this, we might be able to do it, but it's going to take more effort. Whereas at the top of the hill, it would have been really easy. I just had to pick it up. Down the bottom of the hill, this might be, like a runaway train, right? It's like the snowball might be my own body weight by this point, and it's moving at 20 miles an hour or something, right? So it's going to be really, really difficult to stop. But there are things we can do, at least, not so much with the snowball, but at least when we've kind of gone through this process mentally with a catastrophic thinking. So let's say if I'm sitting here in my office and I've been catastrophizing on things and my imagination's running riot and I become aware of it, but I'm really in a high state here. I know emotionally I'm quite charged and yeah, I'm on edge of it. The best thing I could do at that point is to actually leave the room. And the reason this is important is because the physical act of me leaving the room interrupts that process for a moment. If it doesn't, then I'm likely to bump into the hallway or the door or the wall, right? Better than leaving the room, people leave the house. Now, sometimes you might not want to do that at 2 o'clock in the morning. Understood? Might not be such a good idea. But what I'm looking to do is make a physical change and ideally change my location. If I couldn't change my location, let's say if I am in the car and I'm catastrophizing, um, then yeah, it's not a good idea to change seats or something. That's not a good idea. Don't yeah, don't go down that route. But you can take your two fingers and thumb and just squeeze them together. That's not as good as leaving the room, but it's a physical act to help me interrupt this cycle of thinking. Okay, all I'm looking to do is something physical to interrupt this. If I was lying in bed late at night catastrophizing, I would not stay there. Right? So sometimes people have trouble sleeping or what might be termed insomnia. They might find themselves in bed at night and stuff's going over their head, and they might well be catastrophizing. And they'll often try and get control of it in that safe environment, which is much harder. They are much better off getting up, making a cup of tea, or I don't know, having a glass of water, watching TV for 10 minutes, or reading a book for 10 minutes, sat in a different room, than they are staying in that same environment. If they stay in that same environment, it's actually much harder then to break out of this cycle of thinking. So the moment I've kind of made that change, my physical location, it's going to already start to reduce this. So maybe I'm down about here now. And here is actually much easier to start to challenge this and get our perspective back than when we're here and we stay in that same environment. I I've worked in environments where I've seen people get worked up through their catastrophic thinking quite a number of years ago. And some of those people would go off and go outside to smoke a cigarette, but they couldn't smoke in the working environment. And they put their stress reduction down to the cigarette. The reality was what they've done is they'd escaped their environment, they'd done something physical, drawn themselves out of that. So give them an opportunity to get their sense of perspective back. That's really what was going on. It had very little to do with the cigarette, but the act of going outside and escaping that environment they were in where they were quite stressed is what kind of interrupted their kind of thinking and the route they were going down. So hopefully all that makes sense. So the key then is really, like I say, we don't ever really want to end up here, but sometimes we will. Of course, we've spoken a bit about that. But the key is managing it down this end down here. Um, it's actually quite easy down here. So a big part of it is just building up that awareness. So am I being a bit more dramatic with my language? Is my imagination starting to kick in, and am I starting to imagine some worst case scenarios, right? So at that point, if I challenge it, it does get easier. Now, as you start to go through that process, you might find yourself doing this quite a lot if you're quite kind of catastrophic in the first couple of weeks. But the more you interrupt it and the more supportive you are of yourself, the less likely you are to think in that way. So, do I spend a lot of time managing my catastrophic thinking these days? No, not really. I wouldn't say I could never catastrophize because I've always got that, wonderful imagination. I'm just way less likely to, and it's not my default setting anymore because it was just a learned way of thinking. And it's something I got on top of 20 odd years ago. I made a massive, massive difference in terms of my stress levels and the ability to control my emotional state. So I hope you found that useful. If you're watching the recording of this, we will be sharing some resources on this. So there'll be a short quiz that might help you identify how much of a catastrophizer you are, as well as some tips for, again, just a reminder, some crib notes from the session here on pointers for just getting on top of your catastrophic thinking. Uh, if you're watching this in a different platform that's not the school platform, those resources will be in the school platform. So if you're watching this, I don't know, on YouTube or Facebook or wherever it's posted, you can always come over to our platform on school. I think it's school.com/anxiety busters. You can join the group and you'll find those resources that I was just talking about contained within the group. That wrapped it up for me today. I'm just going to stop sharing a moment. Let's just come back here to the school platform. Okay. Okay, I was just going to check. I don't think we've had any questions so far. So you can post questions in the group on the school platform. If you've got questions around this specific topic, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But that about wraps it up. I think I'm just a fraction under 30 minutes, which is sensational for me. I'm trying to keep these videos to time and really keep them concise and short and to the point, rather than talk about the stuff for too long, any one given topic. We can always come back and do more videos on the same topic, right? And maybe there's a lot more we can talk about in relation to catastrophizing for sure. With all that said and done, then I'll wish you a good day and yeah, enjoy thinking about your thinking. Thank you.